A crash introduction to the ethnopolitical situation in Ukraine, thread. People know that Ukraine is divided to Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking areas. That's correct, and yet, people assume that political allegiances match up with ethnolinguistic ones. That's wrong. First, how do we define Ukrainian and Russian-speaking zones? If Russian-speaking zone equals where people predominantly converse in Russian, it's far bigger than that. In February 2014 I was on Maidan, lived, slept there. Everyone I met spoke Russian, except for one woman from Ternopil. That's a very important fact. There are indeed some clearly divided countries like Belgium, Dutch-speaking, rich, conservative Flanders and French-speaking, poor, left-wing Wallonia. Here political divisions match up with ethnolinguistic ones, but not in Ukraine. Almost everyone I met on Maidan spoke Russian among themselves. Many spoke very poor or no Ukrainian, and yet, they strongly identified as Ukrainians, because ethnic identity and political allegiance in case of such mixed-up areas as Eastern Europe are simply matters of choice. There is indeed a political division between the East and the West, as shown on this electoral map. Yellow voted for pro-Russian Yanukovych, blue, for Tymoshenko, and yet, many blue regions are largely or predominantly Russian-speaking. Language is not identity or allegiance. Now let's go a bit deeper. During the discussion on Ukraine or on many other countries, you can often hear that this or that nation is artificial. By symmetry, existence of artificial nations implies the existence of natural ones, and yet, that's BS. I'd say that the most exemplary nation-state in Europe and in the world is France. Unified, centralized, homogeneous, and yet, here is the map of French-speaking regions in France in the early 19th century. As you see, only a part of the country was actually French-speaking. How did the French talk then? Well, historically France was very heterogeneous. Even if we ignore Britannia, Alsace and the Basques, it was still very diverse. The north spoke on the northern dialects, langues d'oil, south, on southern ones. They were mutually ununderstandable. Of course, it's difficult to draw a line between a dialect and a language. Honestly, it's purely political, and yet, there was a continuity of southern dialects stretching from Provence to Catalonia, across all political lines. Southern France and Catalonia were very much alike. Well, how did homogenization happen then? Through state centralization. It really started in 1539 when Francis I ordered the Paris dialect to be used in all official documents all over the country. That's how the dialect of the capital started becoming a national language. Later kings continued these homogenizing policies. For example, after Louis XI annexed a Catalan-speaking Roussillon from Spain in 1700, first thing he did was prohibition of the Catalan language in official use. Of course it all greatly exacerbated after the revolution. In 1794 the Committee of Public Safety declared, federalism and superstition speak Breton, emigration and hatred speak German, counter-revolution speaks Italian and fanaticism speaks Basque. Only much later, through the organized state efforts such as centralized education, media, propaganda, necessity of the French for career and OFC crackdown on any minority tongues, the homogenization was achieved. I strongly recommend this book on why France looks how it looks. So, contrary to the popular belief, it is the diversity which is natural, while homogeneity is artificial. Wherever you see monoculture, be it in language, religion, identity, it is a result of ruthless social engineering, and vice versa, diversity reflects the lack of it. For example, taking a glance at the linguistic map of Anatolia in 1910, this is simplification, it was much more complicated. Google Karamanlides, one can conclude, this is a territory which hasn't gone through a forced homogenization. Yet, that's important for understanding both Ottoman and post-Ottoman history. What is known as the tolerance of the Ottoman Empire can be reconceptualized more neutrally as the lack of willingness to homogenize everyone culturally. As a result, Ottoman lands were incredibly diverse, and once nationalism came here, this non-homogenized land turned into a battlefield between nationalist movements, all of which aimed to forcibly homogenize their territory. So the space between the Austro-Hungarian and Iranian borders was swept by ethnic cleansings, which is why you should be cautious when Balkan, Middle Eastern, Caucasian and so on activists start talking about our land. It's our land equals we want to impose French concept of a nation-state on this non-homogenized territory, which is possible only through ethnic cleansings. Our land equals the land on which we are not only allowed to do genocide, but should be supported in this noble endeavor by the entire humanity. But let's return to Ukraine. By this point we established that natural situation is diversity, while homogeneity is a result of social engineering by the centralized state. The state chooses one faith, one tongue, one identity and pushes them through everyone's throat. And yet, which identity will the state choose to push? In most cases, identity of the capital city, but that's not necessarily the case. When the left bank Ukraine, the hetmanate, became a Russian protectorate in 1654, rather the opposite happened. Of course their language was difficult, Muscovites had to use interpreters to converse with Cherkasy, but that wasn't a problem, because it wasn't politicized yet. Religious differences however, were very, very problematic. They soon discovered that the Ukrainian rites are different. If Muscovite and Ukrainian rites are different, which ones are correct? Ukrainians argued the Muscovite rites were just Greek Orthodox which degenerated over time. Muscovites thought that the Ukrainian, and Byzantine, rites are corrupted by the Catholic influence, which was a terrible threat. The Second Rome, Constantinople, stood for 1,000 years and would stand another 1,000 if the true faith was preserved, but in 1438 Byzantine submitted to the Pope, and in 1453 Constantinople fell, which was clearly a sign of the God's wrath. So now Moscow, the Third Rome, is the last bastion of orthodoxy, the rest of the world being swept either by infidels or by the Latin heresy, and if the Third Rome falls to this heresy, it will share the fate of the Second Rome, which will literally trigger the doomsday, which kinda explains why Muscovite scholars were so skeptical of both Byzantine and Ukrainian rites. Byzantines compromised themselves by the union with Rome, while Ukrainians spent too much time under the Catholic Poland, and had their own union with Catholics, too. With Muscovite and Ukrainian rites being so different, and Russian state centralizing quickly, which ones will it adopt at its own and impose ruthlessly? Counterintuitively it may seem, Muscovite elite wholeheartedly chose Ukrainian ones. There were good reason for that. First of all, old Muscovy was destroyed in the time of troubles by a Western power, and the new one which emerged from the ashes was different. It was oriented westward rather than eastward. It craved for Western culture and Western connections, and Ukraine had so much more of this culture than Muscovy. Just an example, old Muscovy doesn't have any confirmed educational institutions at all. Apparently there was private tutoring, education in small groups, but not a single institutionalized and documented school. First Eastern Slavic and Orthodox educational institutions evolved not in Muscovy but in Poland, Lithuania. In 1576 an Orthodox magnate founds Ostrozhskaya Academy, recruiting ex-professors of Krakow University. Here Ivan Fyodorov printed the first Bible in Old Church Slavonic. In 1580s they establish an Orthodox school in Lviv. In 1613 one of its alumni founds one in Kiev. All of these Eastern Slavic and Orthodox schools were modeled after the Jesuit collegia, because all the intellectual life in Poland, Lithuania was highly influenced by Jesuits.